Thank you for coming. My name is John Freeman. I'll be introducing Aleksandar Hemon. I'd like to say thank you to the Lannan Foundation and to the Lannans for bringing me here to introduce my good friend, Sasha Hemon, to Christy and to Martha for setting up this event, and to all of you for coming to listen to the most marvelous writer alive, in my opinion. It would help if I had him here because first, you will notice the head. The large, bald, magnificent Hemon head, onto which are perched glasses that over the next hour shall be taken off and refastened to facilitate thinking. There will be podium pounding as well and arm waving. But it's the head where it's at, as the kids say. For into this glorious head is stuffed many fine facts, arcana, and observations about David Bowie, beekeeping, Italian film since 1930, a Ukrainian-descended Bosnian-simmered recipe for borscht, the high points of many a World Cup, the songs one sings at a Sarajevo kafana when it is late and everyone is drunk, the particular shade of a wrapper of Chesterfield cigarettes sold in the 1970s, the poems of Robert Lowell, the complete works of Danilo Kish, the street names of Sarajevo circa September 1991, before rumors of war became a conversation, and then a shouting match, and then the end of the world. This head holds within its fractal loops the street addresses for the best barber in the city of Chicago, where the author landed in March of 1992. It knows which grass pitch hosts the finest pickup soccer game in Edgewater, Hemon's neighborhood in that fine city. It can unspool the history of the workers' rights movement, narrate the downward spiral of Stalin's purges, summarize theory of mind, philosophy in an entirely digestible 3-minute chunk. On and on and on the things it knows. Down to that which is less known but rather housed in the body, Hemon's mind, its lighthouse beam. I'm talking about the names and stories of an extended family who has narrativized their existence in the world for generations and have learned how to narrativize its own rupture, marking the before and after with the Balkan War, which kept Aleksandar Hemon in Chicago that winter of 1992 and catapulted his family, to Hamilton, Ontario, some years later, where 2/3 of them now live. One of the glories of Aleksandar Hemon's writing is that he does not simply weave this richness into stories, tales which are hilarious and beautiful and also so streamlined they feel spoken, as if over a cluttered dinner table after a long meal of borscht. But he simultaneously ponders the mysteriousness of consciousness, which is that the mind which is telling the tales was also made by them. This is not the literary equivalent of eating soup in a bread bowl. It is the highest level of narrative artistry, pondering the absurdities of chance and history which create a story, let alone a writer, all while assembling one and being one before our very eyes. He will be doing this here tonight, and I promise you it will be electrifying. Partly because, as you probably know, Aleksandar Hemon did not begin writing in English until he was in his 30s, a sentence as absurd as saying, before he was president, Barack Obama suffered from stage fright. Since his short stories began appearing in American literary journals and soon thereafter The New Yorker, every sentence that Aleksandar Hemon has written is a kind of simultaneous arrival and reclamation, as if the vast and tentacular intelligence raised in Bosnian is straining forever at the barriers of its new instrument of expression. This pressure and viscosity makes him the best writer alive about the strangeness of reality, which, let's face it, is getting stranger every day. Because he is always colliding with reality, grappling with it, pointing out its inanities. Never does he take it for granted. In his 2 short story collections, 3 novels, and 1 book of biographical essays, Hemon has used this fury to deal with reality, to create a literature of an intense sensory beauty, metaphysical longing, ribald humor, and powerful moral clarity. Even though these books entertain, they are not small talk. They study the wishbone of human suffering and ask, who gets to pull first? These are stories, as with the question of Bruno and Love and Obstacles, of exile and regret. This is a novel, as with Nowhere Man, about the obliteration of the self and the attempt to live without a place one calls home. This is the only novel, as in The Lazarus Project in American literature, to my mind, to absorb and refract the brutalities of the Bush years and find, in their continuance, a tale about our eternal quest to be better than how we kill. This is a black farce, as in The Making of Zombie Wars, which asks, what does all this spectacular entertainment distract us from? What are we if we cannot finish a single thought? These are essays, as in The Book of My Lives, which narrate the overlapping of and then and now of places and people which made Mr. Hemon the writer and generous soul he is. They ask if bearing witness to all of it having been, including the boy he once was, is enough. This question he will reveal tonight can never truly be answered. We will never be able to separate the being from the telling. And thank God for that, because the endlessness of this task brings you stories and prose, the likes of which you will hear right now. Ladies and gentlemen, my friend, Aleksandar Hemon.
Thank you, John Freeman. Thank you all. Thank you, the Lannan Foundation and the Lannans for having me here and my head. This is the head he was talking about. I recently acquired it. I will read from an unpublished book. It will be published sometime next year. And it's called This Does Not Belong to You. It consists of a number of short pieces without titles. So I will pause between between the pieces and have a sip of water. Let it be the tell. So here we go. Once upon a time, in a land far, far away, on a mountain called Jahorina, there was an old hotel called Šator. It was half an hour from Sarajevo, but a stone throw away from our family mountain cabin, from what I now refer to as my previous life. The hotel was open only in the winter. When you stood in the snow outside it, under a frigid starry sky, it reeked of cafeteria grease, of wood stoves and cigarette smoke. You'd hear the thumping from the disco club in the basement. For the rest of the year, the hotel was vacant. One summer when I was 10, I broke into the hotel bar by cracking its window. It took me an hour, and stole a bottle of blueberry juice. I had no particular interest in juice. I just wanted to open the window. But once I got in, I needed to take something to prove that I'd done it. The bartender, who idled in the summer, caught and blackmailed me, asking for money not to tell my parents about my break-in. I told him to fuck off. He told my parents. They punished me, but that blueberry juice was the sweetest potion, and I'd never have any regrets about it. The hotel cleaning staff was Baya, a woman of an undetermined body shape and age who lingered in and around the hotel, always clad in a blue overcoat, a black scarf on her head, one of its corners covering her jaw to keep warm. She was like a ghost, impervious to pain. She had an eternal toothache she would never treat, the abscess swelling until it devoured and destroyed her left eye. Nobody ever saw her clean anything, though a friend of my parents who'd stayed at the hotel told us that Baya had once walked into his room without knocking, looked around and said, "Why don't you clean this up? It's disgusting." Right behind the hotel, there was a crested boulder where we'd climb when there was nothing else to do, which in the summer was most of the time. If we looked from the top toward where we came from, we could see the weekend house cluster below. Hear the buzzing of circular saws, the banging of hammers, the din of aspiration. For everyone was perpetually getting ready for some future in which their active lives would be successfully completed. and there'd be nothing but peace, virginal nature, and socialist retirement. The war would irreversibly cancel the future. But back then, when we were kids, the future was always on its way, its advanced currents humming inside everything we knew or cared to know. If we looked in the other direction, wooded vales and peaks, meadows and roads stretched towards Sarajevo and further beyond it, onward to the horizon, into which, at the end of the day, the sun would slot like a coin. We'd stand at the edge of the boulder, pine and fir tips arising from the verdant void beneath our feet, and we'd look and look and look. Our visual field had no limits in the exactly same way our life had no end. The garbage from the hotel was dumped right behind it, down the slope at the foot of the boulder. My sister and I didn't find it strange. By the time we emerged from our unconscious childhood, the world seemed fully established in all its details. Everything as it was, everything happening as it happened, all the points and objects fixed, all the hierarchies and structures natural and unalterable. We'd descend from the peak to the garbage dump to browse through trash-stuffed plastic bags and rotten food remnants. One day, we found a plethora of plates, saucers, cups, and bowls strewn all over the dump. The hotel had replaced their dishes with new ones. We spent the whole day smashing the old dishes with rocks against one another. We discussed nothing, devised no plans. It was clear to us that we needed what needed to be done, and we just did it. The dishes were nondescript, beige. We shattered them into smithereens, taking a break for lunch, smashing some more in the afternoon. Thus, we discover the pleasure of unbridled, unlimited destruction, the endless joy of converting everything into nothing. We sustained small cuts, but didn't care. They were the blisters of toil, the stigmata of devotion. I realize now it was one of the happiest days of my childhood, perhaps of my entire life. And when we went back to the dump sometime later and found more garbage, the new generations of refuse, we knew that underneath it all, there were our smithereens. We knew that we could keep forging them for as long as we lived, and that we would always remember the day we broke the limited whole. Thank you. All the grown-ups were huddling around the table in Teta Stefina's kitchen, half of them smoking, the other half inhaling. There was a little baby in the other room, my sister, I believe, so I couldn't go there either. Couldn't get to the bookshelves, to the Bible, to Horse Heaven Hill, or to the greatest spies of World War II, because she was sleeping over there. The hallway was dark and unheated, and there was nothing to do. No books, no toys, nothing. They smoked in the kitchen, and there was nowhere to sit, nothing to do. I drank my blueberry juice, asked for more. They said no. I played with the shoes for a while, lined them up in rows, mismatched them, scrambled them, then opened the kitchen door and announced, "I'm going home." And they laughed and said, "Go, go, what do we care?" They didn't take me seriously, didn't believe me. They thought I was a little boy, helpless. In the winter of 1970, I was 5 years old. I put on my shoes and coat, my hat and scarf, my gloves, extended myself on the tip of my toes to unlock the door, and home I went. It was winter, snow on the ground, night all around. A lifelong project it's been for me, going home. The streets were desolate, or I don't remember seeing anyone outside. Strangers were invisible to me back then. The snowbanks were up to my shoulders, the starry sky above, though those could have been just the lights in the hills. I'd never walked home all by myself from Marin Dvor, from where Teta Josefina and Chica Martin lived. But somehow, like a cat, I knew how to return. I followed the tramway rail, crossed the street at the technical school, walked along the army barracks fence. The snow squealed under my feet. I wasn't afraid. I knew where I was going. There were scattershot lit barracks windows, soldiers awake. Though I'd never done it, all I needed to make it home was in place. My world had been established with all the relevant markers because I was my world, and everything was as it was. I possessed a map of myself, and I knew how to read it. Meanwhile, at Teta Josefina's, my parents turned on the lights to look for me all over the apartment, and I was nowhere to be found because I wasn't there. They phoned Tetka Katica, who was staying with us that winter, but I wasn't home either. Where is he? My mother cried into the phone. Is he there? I wasn't there. I was here, walking along a narrow path in the snow, the soldiers beyond the lights greasing their rifles, keeping their eye on me. Thank you. Teta Stefa enjoyed murder and death. She would slurp coffee with Luciano's mother and exchange gruesome stories, like the one about the woman whose son slit her throat so thoroughly that her head was hanging on a strip of neck skin. Teta Stefa claimed she knew this woman, her name. She occupied the same reality as the mother and her decapitating son, but was not troubled by it at all. She was never afraid that something like that could happen to her. Indeed, there was a certain joy in her delivery of the morbid stories. She was amazed and delighted that such things could happen in this world, that there was darkness others could not see, whereas she could report from it. She would dip a sugar cube into her coffee, put it in her mouth, and while it was still melting, the sweetness spreading all over her taste buds, she would tell her friend, and by default me, about a passenger on a fast train who stuck his head out the window to see if the next stop was coming up. But it turned out that what was coming up was a telephone pole that took his head off. After a while, I developed a suspicion that she might be exaggerating. But I also knew that if she could imagine it, it could happen. If a question can be formulated, there is an answer. She told us once about the baby that was left alone in the kitchen where there was a bunch of green onions on the counter. And inside the plume of one of those onions, there was a snake. Snakes are attracted to milk, as everyone knows. So this snake crawled out of the green onion plume and across the room and into the crib, and then into the baby through its baby mouth because it smelled of milk. I believe she claimed that the baby had died. I do not know what had happened to the snake. This story affected me because green onions and babies were part of my experiential domain, of my reality. If my mother brought green onions from the market, I'd sit there and monitor the plumes. Too afraid to check them for snakes, but brave enough to keep watch over my baby sister. Never again in my life, including the present depletion, did I look at green onions without considering a snake inside one of its blooms. For the world to exist, there have to be objects. And inside those objects, there has to be nothing. And inside that nothing, there are memories. And inside those memories, there are snakes. Thank you. This is like singing. It's what happened to Ella Fitzgerald once upon a time. And my latest record is A mob of boys, led by Dule, advanced down the street in a V formation like geese. Dule would have been a high schooler had he not dropped out. He was tall, lanky, and stinking of sweat, missing some of his front teeth, his shirt unbuttoned to the navel, all of which meant he was tough, a yaliash. The boy mob was on a retributive mission. Some of them had been smacked around by an older kid, not from our street, who had caught them behind Kino Arena. It was a movie theater. Who had caught them behind Kino Arena. He'd shaken them down for money so that he could go see a Bruce Lee flick. All this happened centuries ago at the height of the Kung Fu era. The raw boys had hurried to fetch Dule, whose duty, by virtue of being older and toothlessly ruthless, was to protect the little Raya, the kids from his street who, as part of the tacit code, regularly paid their tribute by fetching cigarettes for him or titty magazines. So, there was the advancing Dule, unevenly grinning, followed by the flock of excited, bloodthirsty boys. The adolescent kid who robbed my Raya lingered behind the movie theater with a couple of his sidekicks, assuming a pose of confidence and cockiness, much too precocious and unwise. I watched it all from the wall above the street, as if from the bleachers. This is what I remember better than anything. As the kid was mouthing off with his cocky attitude, which would have been enough for us to accept defeat and retreat, Dule just walked up and kicked him in the head with such speed and force that the boy's nose instantly exploded, blood splashing on the pavement before he even hit the ground. Within a moment, the kid was moaning in shock and terror, shrimping up to protect his stomach. Dule kicked him in the head one more time, just to show that he could beat him for as long as he wished, then turned around and walked away. He was not mad. He said nothing. He needed no words to produce a clear meaning. I could see his incisors like goalposts. The sidekicks vanished. We watched, horrified and triumphant, because this meant that the kid and his Raya would never again come anywhere near us, let alone bully us. Our standing in the hood had just significantly improved. The kid got up and tottered away, leaving a trail of noseblood and a single canvas tennis shoe behind, while we mocked and taunted him. The whole thing lasted but for a couple of moments. The brutality was exhilarating, the exactness of the violence awesome, the release of tension so pleasing, the victory sweet. None of us in the little Raya could simply walk up to another kid and annihilate him without negotiation or mercy. Watching Dule, we learned that to win a fight, you have to be willing to destroy your opponent totally, that you must never consider his body, worry about his pain. Do not start a fight unless you're capable of destroying the opponent. Do not start a war unless you're willing to commit genocide. But I am not, willing to destroy others. It is arguably my greatest shortcoming. From my high position, despite the exhilaration, I felt sorry for the kid. I saw his blood, his terror, and the worst of all, his dirty tennis shoe. He was going home without that shoe. His parents would ask him, "Where is your shoe?" and set him out to look for it, and he would know where it was, but he would not dare get anywhere close to it, and he would wander around his hut crying, his face swollen with pain and bruises, breathing heavily through his broken nose, imagining ways of revenge, knowing all along that it could never happen, that he was comprehensively and forever beaten, that he was nothing but a plain, cowardly bully and not a destroyer nor a killer. He wasn't strong or fast or ruthless enough to be one, and he'd go back home and tell his parents that he couldn't find his shoe, and his father would whip him with a belt or slam his face against the wall, making him go barefoot to school. Sometime later, the boy would destroy some other kid, maybe even me. This is the way of the world. So many of these pieces, I start out by saying or thinking, I don't remember. And then I proceed to remember. The domain of memory is surrounded by a universe of oblivion, ever growing outside of what I know. Every time I recall, I take off my shoes, dip my toes into that void, and it's as cold as the snow melting in the spring. All of these pieces are related to experiences that happened to me before I was 12 or so. Something happened at the age of 12. In any case, it was October. We sat on the concrete flower boxes, which contained no flowers nor any kind of plants, and our butts were freezing cold. The tinge of toxic smog and roasted chestnuts made it all romantic and beautiful, so I had my arm across her shoulder in preparation for a kiss, which would have been our first, my second, or maybe even third. Her name was Amela. She was the tallest and the sportiest girl in my class, and she had long, waterfall hair and, relatively speaking, substantial breasts, which she unsuccessfully suppressed with oversized sweaters. I dared not think of the possibility of touching those breasts. Summoning enough courage for a kiss was well beyond me. We sat on the concrete boxes, saying nothing, as we both knew that the only possible thing to do next was to press our lips together. Yet I couldn't. What we cannot speak of, we must pass over in silence. So we sat in silence, except that every once in a while she'd say, "I have to go home." And I'd say, 5 more minutes, whereupon we would sit in silence for another 5 minutes. There's no solution to time. I could come up with no words, no actions. My fingers were still sooty from having peeled roasted chestnuts. Had I touched her, I would have left a trace on her body. She finally got up, unkissed, untouched, and I walked her home. I know now it was then that our coupling became unlikely, that I lost her, the fact that I'd never had her notwithstanding. I'll never know what would have happened had I kissed her and thus got upgraded from being her crush to being her official, steady boyfriend. She could jump shoot on the basketball court. Her ponytail bounced in splendorous slow motion. She could dribble the ball too, get past defenses. She was a winner. Whereas I couldn't see that it was all already lost, so I hoped and kept hoping. And when she invited me to come over to her house one Sunday, the hope swelled like a teenage penis. A field of possible kisses emerged before my mind, and then another virgin landscape beyond it, a world where things unimaginable took place, where all-access nakedness was surely the norm. For days, I rehearsed in my head the pre-kiss head tilt and the subsequent slow-motion advance past the defense toward her lips where, as I'd been advised by my allegedly experienced older cousin, I should insert my tongue to move its tip all around the oral cavity while making manual inroads to at least one of her substantial breasts. The day of my visit to her quarters, I blow-dried my hair until it resembled a helmet, and I donned a V-neck sweater with without a shirt, or even an undershirt, and I wore clean, tight, somewhat short pants, exposing my white socks. I did have doubts when I looked in the mirror. It did occur to me that I might have looked like a cretin, but I decided to believe in myself. It was naturally a grave mistake. For when I got to Amela's place, it was instantly clear that I'd fully misjudged the promise I'd perceived as implicit in her invitation. Her best girlfriend at the time was there, as well as a couple of 8th graders, not only older than me, but confidently and shamelessly adolescent, which is to say they smoked and spoke with that brash yaliash braggadocio, using a code I could not attempt to comprehend, showing no interest whatsoever in me, in what I had to say, in my claim to Amela. And she was enthralled with one of them, a certain Amir, whose unruly hair bespoke a studied negligence, and who was so full of himself that he could even afford to pretend he had little interest in her substantial breasts. He kept cracking jokes that made Amela repeatedly push her Rapunzel hair behind her ears, whereas I, the boy in a V-neck sweater sporting a cretinoid do, said glumly and passively, signaling my despair with the subtlety of a socialist factory siren on May Day. So devastated and disconsolate was I after the romantic fiasco that I wrote a poem entitled, "Is This Death or Rebirth?" It is a true story. It had 4 stanzas, in the first of which the poetic subject dies, just like I had, as Amir sneered and puffed smoke rings at me, that doomed Sunday at her place. The poetic subject is subsequently miraculously transferred to a prehistoric afterworld wherein dinosaurs roam and pterodactyls flock in the sky, and is thereby forced to ask himself and the reader, that is the pitiless Amela, is this death or rebirth? The world of an unhappy boy is very different from that of the happy one. I put my poem in an envelope, moistened the flat with my tears, metaphorically speaking, and shoved it in passing into her school uniform pocket. She never said anything about it. She never let me get anywhere close to her again. What if we live in the unhappened, in the universe of nevermore? The world is everything that is the case, and life is everything that might have been so. Thank you. We'd leave the coast early to escape the heat. Sometimes it would still be dark, but eventually we'd witness the Yorkie sunrise. My sister and I would be in the back seat, unbuckled. Our bodies were still warm, but also itchy, because the sunburns we had earned on the beach matured into dried skin, which now unpeeled in little scrolls. We smelled of salt and Nivea cream. Our hair was longer, drier, like hay, our nails sharper, talon-like, the tips of our fingers desiccated from the sea and the sun, so that everything felt different to the touch, brittle and more distant. We drive through the expanses of blazing Herzegovinian stone, through the valley of the Neretva, the green water, the blue sky, the sheer white cliffs. Tata, ever impatient, would be tormented by a slow truck ahead until he passed it at a speed beyond the limit, so Mama would object, scold him for the way he drove. They would bicker for a bit, but eventually they'd reach the standard level of mutual resentment and everything would be okay. We had just spent 10 days in Makarska, in a modest hotel owned by Elektroprenos, the company Tata worked for. He was usually bored during the vacation because there was nothing to do, no projects to invest time and effort in, nothing to complete, nothing to leave behind. Sometimes he'd vanish from the beach in search of something to do and would not come back before it was time for lunch. Mama would dispatch me to find him, and I'd wander up and down the beach, or along the asphalt path where I'd have to walk barefoot and once stepped on a burning cigarette butt. I'd search for him in bars, which he had no interest in, or in places where teenagers hung out, smoking and playing football, where he would never go, or at newsstands where he might browse through the papers but seldom buy one. It was never easy to find him. He was always elsewhere, pursuing obscure leads into making something happen. Once I discovered him painting in his swimming trunks a fishing boat with a local guy. He had struck up a conversation with a man and then offered to help him. When I found him, his hands were smeared with paint, a blue blot on his chest. Mama did not wonder. She preferred to read or sunbathe while watching us pretend to swim in the pebbled shallows. My sister would swallow copious amounts of seawater because she opened her mouth wide when she laughed, and the sea made her happy. When Mama got into the water, she never played with us, taking her swimming as seriously as she did everything else. She swam paddling with her hands, keeping her head above the water lest her carefully puffed up hair should get wet. In the evenings, we'd take a stroll together, have sugar-powered fry dough and ice cream from a cone whose top was shaped like a 3-leaf clover so that we could get chocolate, vanilla, and banana flavors and keep them separate, moving our tongues from one to another until they became tricolor. All of that would be converted into the past as soon as we headed home, driving up the Biokova mountain and then farther, leaving the sea behind and out of sight. And it would become distant past after we passed through the Ivan mountain tunnel and entered Bosnia proper, which would often be smothered by clouds and rain, the sun entirely exterminated. My sister and I would be bored for the duration of the drive, and we would sing. We didn't strive to break our boredom. We embraced and owned it, driving our parents crazy by singing a song that could last forever. There once was a dog with belt who made a cook mad, and the cook took a knife and cut the dog in two, and the other dogs came, dug a grave for him, and put up a tombstone on which it read, "There once was a dog who made a cook mad, and the cook took a knife and cut the dog in two, and the other dogs came, dug a grave for him, and put up a tombstone on which it read, there once was a dog." Everybody now. "There once was a dog who made a cook mad, and the cook took a knife and cut the dog in two, and the other dogs came, dug a grave for him, and put up a tombstone on which it read," and so on. Ad infinitum, or until we arrive home. We can describe the lapse of time only by relying on some other process. In the hallway of our building, which was always cool because it never saw the sun, I would inhale the smells of our neighbors' lives, their cooking, their sweat, whatever was used to wash the hallway stairs. At the top of the 3rd floor staircase leading to our home, there was a stain cascading down the stairs, a consequence of my dropping a bottle of milk when I was 5 or 6. Nearly 50 years later, the stain is still there. I see it every time I return to Sarajevo and stay in the apartment my sister and I grew up in. And when we finally entered the apartment, everything would be exactly as we left it, except for the clean scent of our absence. Without us there was no life. No one cooked. No one went to the bathroom. No one washed hands. No one drank coffee. No one turned on the lights or the TV. No one lived there. And all the windows and doors to the balconies were closed, so that only the walls, carpets, furniture, old magazines and newspapers stacked on the radio exuded existence. I love that emptiness because each and every time we refilled it with ourselves. Before we returned, there was nothing. And then, within a moment, there was everything, because we were there, and there was a here that belonged to us, that was us. That's all. Thank you.